All right, so in this video, I'm going to talk about the pros and cons of having many stories versus few stories in your story bank. And I'd say right from the start that expectations are, of course, different from someone with 20 years of experience on the job where compared to a fresher, right? But still, I believe the comparison makes sense, as you'll see next. So first, let's look at the 50 story approach. So what happens is if you have so many stories, there are a couple of pros to this approach. And the main one, I believe, is that you're highly unlikely to repeat your stories during a job interview, which is actually an increasingly significant issue for the job interviews. Because what happens here is you repeat your stories over and over again. You might be perceived as someone who lacks sufficient experience or didn't prepare enough for the interview, or tries to bias the interviewer intentionally with, hey, that guy only has 2 stories he wants to talk about, right? So it's not a good, you're basically going to be covered against this scenario. Also, if you have 50 stories in your story bank, you'll be covered for what I call rapid fire rounds. That is, the interviewer is asking you many questions within a short time span and asks you for concise answers. This does happen in places such as Amazon, when they can screen you even twice for all their leadership principles in 1 hour, right? So if you have 50 stories, then you have plenty to choose from, right? All right, and the third pro of having this many stories is that it's a sign you invested time in the interview prep, which is a significant indicator of success in intense interviews, right? Now let's look at some cons of having this many stories in your story bank. And the first one I'd like to highlight here is that usually people who have 50 or more stories don't actually have 50 different stories, but more like 1 or 2 dozen main stories, and then there are variations of those key stories. Or some people go as far to call a story an interview question. So if you have to answer 50 questions, it doesn't mean you have 50 stories, right? So you have a couple of main ones, and then you have versions of that. It's important to acknowledge this, because if you don't, then basically you don't have stories, you just have answers to questions, right? So you have to go one step further to acknowledge what's a story versus simply an interview answer, right? And I have other places where I explain the difference between answering a question versus using a story to answer a question, right? It's much better to have a story, long story short. The second thing is that if you have this many stories, that is the quantitative approach, right? You spend time to come up with 50 or more stories, you probably won't have as much time to revise them, right? And I recommend people to revise at least 3 times their stories, right? So if you go on the quantitative approach, you might miss out on the qualitative approach a bit, right? And the last disadvantage of having these many stories is that it will be not as straightforward to remember them, right? So you should give them extremely concise and keyworded names so they can be easy to remember. It's not impossible. I have people who prepare interviews successfully with 60 stories, right? And they remember all of them, but just that you must be aware that they're harder to maintain if they're this big, right? Now, let's look at the other extreme. What happens if you only have, let's say, 10 stories in your story bank? What are the pros and cons of this? And probably the main pro of such an approach of having these few stories is that you have plenty of time to revise them, right? So the qualitative approach, as I said. So if you only, I know people who can come up with 10 stories within 1 hour, and then they can invest time to revise them at least 3 times, right? This is the first one. The second element here of having these few stories is some people prefer, for example, you had 18 stories in the beginning, but then you decided, hey, 3 of those stories are not worth talking about during a job interview. I don't feel comfortable. They're not as good. So you basically trim down the fat. And that's the reason why you ended up with fewer possible stories. Remember, I said in the 50 stories approach, you don't have 50, but you have more like 2 dozen stories, which are variations of those key elements, right? So acknowledging to trim down the fat and not to use your worst stories for the purpose of it is another element that you should be aware of for your own story bank. Or maybe you don't feel comfortable talking about something. Usually people don't feel comfortable talking about certain experience with some colleagues or with their previous boss, right? So if you don't feel comfortable, you just ditch it and find something else, find a better one that you feel comfortable talking about, right? And The third pro of having a small story bank is that it's very easy to remember, right? So it's straightforward to remember 10 stories versus 50. Okay, and now what are the cons of having so few stories? 10 or let's say only 10 or 15 stories in your story bank. Well, the main problem I have with this approach is that you're unlikely to cover all the key behaviors that you can expect questions on. So in other words, the probability that you're going to be surprised with behavioral questions during an interview increases. And what happens here is that the difference in behavioral interviews is not made in the ability to answer them, but in the quality of your answers, right? Whereas if you didn't prepare on something, that you're going to be challenged to answer that question in the first place. Whereas if you prepared it, then the focus will be on the quality of your answer, right? So if you cannot prepare on all the behaviors, you're likely to be surprised during your interview. The second problem I have with this approach with too few stories is that repeating your stories in the job interview, in an intense job interview, becomes a problem. And as I said in the beginning of the video, if you expect an intense on-site round, let's say you have 6 rounds of your final on-site, I doubt that those 10 stories could be used independently and only once for your interview, right? So to give the classic example of Amazon, they screen you on 2 leadership principles per round. 6 times 2 is 12 already. Whereas if you only prepare 10 of them, it's impossible not to repeat them, right? Now, from experience, you won't get disqualified if you repeat them once, right? But still, it's going to be challenging for you not to repeat yourself over and over and over again in these job interviews, okay? Especially because if you're expecting an intense one. The third problem with preparing so few stories is that you might simply not be prepared enough for the purpose of a job interview. And to explain here, you're prepared for a job interview, at least on the behavioral side, when you feel empowered by your interview prep, when you have your story bank and you can be proud of your story bank, right? Whereas if you only prepare 10 stories, chances are you didn't pass that critical chasm, where you feel proud of your answers and you can communicate the level of confidence that you have during the actual job interview, right? So long story short, I believe my advice helped you to find the right balance between having many versus few stories for your story bank, because I know that one of the main challenges you have preparing a job interview is time. You don't have time to prepare it. So you have to strike somehow the right balance, again, in a goal for you to help you to feel more empowered and more positive for the purpose of your upcoming job interview. So I hope you found this information useful, and thank you very much for watching.